Deep in the mist-shrouded hollows of Appalachia, where ancient mountains keep their secrets buried beneath centuries of silence, there lived families whose names were whispered like warnings around dying fires. These weren't your typical mountain clans struggling to survive on hardscrabble land. No, since these were bloodlines that had made bargains with forces older than the hills themselves, trading their humanity for power that defied explanation. Between 1830 and 1920, 5 families rose from desperate poverty to inexplicable prosperity in ways that left their neighbors terrified and suspicious. Their success came at a cost so horrifying that even today, local historians refuse to document their stories, fearing that speaking their names might somehow resurrect the darkness they unleashed. What you're about to discover are the true accounts of families so dangerous, so fundamentally altered by their unholy pacts, that entire communities would abandon their homes rather than live in their shadow. These aren't tales of simple mountain feuds or moonshine wars. These are stories of bloodlines that crossed lines no human should ever cross, and the terrible prices they paid for generations. The first family we encounter made a deal in the depths of a cursed mine shaft, where something ancient and hungry waited in the darkness. Their prosperity built an empire, but every full moon, the mountain demanded its tribute in blood. The second family discovered that healing others came with a price, measured not in money, but in flesh and sanity. Each cure they performed carved away pieces of their own souls until nothing remained but hollow shells walking through endless nightmares. The third family learned that wealth flows freely when you feed the right entities, but their children were born marked, carrying the physical evidence of their ancestors' bargains etched into their very bones. The fourth family found musical talent beyond human comprehension, but their songs became prisons, trapping listeners in melodies that rewrote reality itself. The fifth family mastered the art of cutting timber that shouldn't exist in forests that grew according to rules that predated human understanding. What makes these families particularly terrifying isn't just what they did to gain their power, but how they maintained it across generations. Each bloodline developed its own twisted traditions, passing down not just knowledge, but actual supernatural abilities that grew stronger with each generation. Children born into these families weren't just inheriting wealth or property. They were inheriting curses that transformed them into something barely recognizable as human. Local records from the period, when they exist at all, paint a picture of communities living in constant fear. Entire valleys would empty when these families moved in. Churches would close rather than risk having them attend services. Even law enforcement, such as it was in those remote regions, would find convenient reasons to avoid investigating crimes connected to these bloodlines. The most disturbing aspect of these families wasn't their supernatural abilities or their willingness to sacrifice others for their own gain. It was how they justified their actions, creating elaborate belief systems that painted themselves as chosen ones, destined to inherit power that ordinary humans couldn't comprehend. They saw their victims not as people, but as necessary components in rituals that maintained their elevated status. But power gained through such methods always comes with hidden costs. As we'll discover, each family's prosperity was built on foundations that grew increasingly unstable with each passing generation. The entities they served weren't partners in their success. but patient predators waiting for the perfect moment to collect what they were truly owed. The evidence of their activities remains scattered throughout Appalachian folklore, hidden in local legends that were deliberately obscured to prevent future generations from repeating their mistakes. Archaeologists occasionally uncover artifacts that hint at the scope of their operations, but these discoveries are quickly classified and removed from public access. What's most chilling is how these families' influence extended far beyond their immediate territories. Their supernatural abilities allowed them to manipulate events across entire regions, pulling strings that affected everything from local politics to natural disasters. They became puppet masters operating from the shadows, their true power hidden behind facades of legitimate business operations. The mountain communities that survived their reign developed elaborate protection rituals, creating barriers both physical and spiritual to keep these families from returning. Some of these traditions persist today, though most who practice them have forgotten why they're necessary. Modern researchers who've attempted to investigate these families report equipment malfunctions, lost documentation, and an inexplicable reluctance among locals to discuss what they know. It's as if the mountains themselves resist efforts to expose these secrets, protecting knowledge that's perhaps too dangerous for contemporary understanding. The few surviving descendants of these families live under assumed names, scattered across the country, carrying genetic markers that scientists struggle to explain. They speak of inherited memories, dreams that aren't their own, and abilities that manifest unpredictably, suggesting that whatever changed their ancestors continues to influence their bloodlines even today. What makes these stories particularly relevant is how they illustrate the lengths desperate people will go to escape poverty and powerlessness. Each family began with ordinary individuals facing extraordinary hardships, making choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but led to consequences that consumed entire generations. The entities they encountered weren't random supernatural forces, but intelligences that had been waiting patiently for humans desperate enough to make the right kind of bargains. These beings understood human psychology better than humans understood themselves, crafting offers that seemed beneficial while hiding costs that wouldn't become apparent until it was far too late to escape. As we examine each family's story, we'll discover how their initial success attracted others to make similar bargains, creating networks of corruption that spread like infections through Appalachian communities. The supernatural abilities they gained weren't just personal advantages, but tools for recruiting others into their twisted belief systems. The documentation of their activities reveals a pattern of escalating demands from the entities they served. What began as simple offerings of blood or personal sacrifice gradually expanded to include the lives of family members, neighbors, and eventually entire communities. The families found themselves trapped in relationships where refusing to pay the increasing costs meant losing everything they'd gained. Their stories serve as warnings about the true nature of power and the price of shortcuts to success. They remind us that there are forces in this world that view human ambition as an invitation to exploitation, and that some bargains, once made, can never be unmade. The mountains of Appalachia still echo with the consequences of their choices, and on the darkest nights, When the mist rolls through ancient valleys, locals claim you can still hear the whispers of entities that once claimed these families as their own, waiting patiently for the next generation of desperate souls willing to trade their humanity for power. The stories you just heard are only the beginning. What makes these 5 families truly terrifying isn't just the supernatural bargains they struck, but how their descendants carried forward those dark traditions, adapting ancient practices to modern times while maintaining the same predatory relationships with otherworldly entities. The Holloway mining operation might have collapsed in 1928, but the coal industry in Pike County never forgot the lessons learned from that impossible productivity. When strip mining began transforming the Appalachian landscape in the 1950s, several companies discovered that their most profitable sites were invariably located on former Holloway territory. Equipment operators reported the same phenomena that had plagued the original mine. Tools would be found rearranged in the morning, arranged in configurations that somehow made them more efficient. The distinctive sound of pickaxes striking stone echoed from deep within the earth during the winter solstice, even where no active mining was taking place. More disturbing were the recruitment patterns. Mining companies operating in the region began reporting unusually high numbers of applicants who shared certain physical characteristics. Employees with that distinctive silvery sheen to their skin, with eyes that reflected light, like nocturnal animals. These workers demonstrated an uncanny ability to navigate underground spaces without artificial lighting and could sense structural weaknesses in mine shafts before modern equipment detected them. Personnel files from the 1960s describe entire work crews who claim to be cousins or distant relatives of the original Holloway family, though genealogical records showed no connection to any known Holloway bloodline. The most chilling discovery came in 1987 when a mining accident at the Widow's Peak site revealed a chamber that shouldn't have existed according to geological surveys. The room contained dozens of wooden boxes, each about the size of a shoebox, arranged in careful rows. Inside each box were carefully preserved items: a lock of hair, a few drops of what appeared to be blood, and small pieces of coal that glowed faintly in the darkness. Each box was labeled with a name and date, spanning from 1888 to 1987, suggesting that whatever ritual Samuel Holloway had begun in the deep shaft had continued uninterrupted for nearly a century. The Carver timber legacy evolved in ways that defied both business logic and natural law. After Martin Carver's disappearance in 1997, the family trust assumed control of operations, but the trustees themselves remained mysteriously anonymous. Legal documents listed only post office boxes and phone numbers that connected to automated systems. Yet Carver timber continued to flourish, acquiring vast tracts of previously protected forest land through bureaucratic channels that environmental groups couldn't challenge despite obvious irregularities. Logging crews working for the company reported increasingly strange phenomena. Trees would be found already felled in the morning, cut with precision that human equipment couldn't achieve, arranged in patterns that resembled ancient symbols. The wood from these mysteriously harvested trees possessed unusual properties. Lumber from Carver operations never rotted, never attracted insects, and remained structurally sound far longer than any known wood preservation method could explain. Most unsettling were the sounds that echoed through active logging sites after sunset. Workers described hearing children's laughter echoing through the forest, always just beyond the range of flashlights. Security cameras installed to prevent theft consistently captured images of small figures moving between the trees, but the footage became increasingly distorted the closer the figures came to the equipment. Audio recordings revealed voices speaking in what linguists described as a dialect that seemed to blend English with something far older, using grammatical structures that didn't match any known language family. The pattern of child disappearances that had plagued the original Carver bloodline appeared to have expanded beyond the family itself. Between 1998 and 2015, 17 children vanished from communities within a 50-mile radius of active Carver logging operations. In each case, the missing child was found days later, unharmed but fundamentally changed. They returned with knowledge of forest survival techniques they couldn't have learned, speaking of friends who lived in the trees and teaching them games that required precise understanding of woodland ecology. These returned children invariably developed an obsession with woodworking, creating intricate carvings that displayed skill levels impossible for their age. Their artwork invariably featured the same recurring motifs: circles of trees, figures dancing in groves, and symbols that matched those found at abandoned Carver work sites. When questioned about their experiences, the children would describe visits to a place where the trees sang and kind people who looked like shadows taught them important lessons about the old ways. The Lowel healing tradition had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than Margaret's original compassionate practice. While the family clinic had officially closed in 1972, locals throughout the Cumberland Gap region continued to speak of healing women who could be found by those desperate enough to seek them out. But the rules for finding these healers had become increasingly elaborate and specific. Those seeking healing had to follow a precise protocol that seemed designed to test their desperation. The journey began by leaving specific offerings at certain locations: a photograph of the afflicted person at a crossroads, a lock of their hair tied to a specific tree, drops of their blood left on stones arranged in particular patterns. Only after completing these preliminary rituals would the seeker receive dreams, providing directions to the current healer's location. The healers themselves appeared to be rotating through the region, never staying in one location for more than a few months. They occupied cabins that seemed to exist in a state of constant change, with rooms that appeared larger on the inside than the exterior walls could accommodate. Visitors described entering through a simple mountain cabin door and finding themselves in spaces that stretched far beyond what the structure's footprint could contain. The healing process had become increasingly ritualistic. Patients were required to participate in ceremonies that lasted exactly 13 hours, during which they would experience the full progression of their illness in accelerated form. They would suffer every symptom, every pain, every moment of fear and weakness that their condition would eventually cause, compressed into half a day of intense experience. Only after enduring this complete manifestation of their disease would the healing take effect. The cost of these healings had evolved beyond the simple transfer of symptoms that had characterized the original Lowell gift. Modern healers demanded payment in memories, specifically the patient's most cherished recollections. Those who sought healing would find themselves unable to remember their wedding day, their children's births, or their happiest moments. The memories weren't simply forgotten, but seemed to be actively transferred to the healer, who would occasionally reference personal details about patients' lives that they couldn't possibly know. More disturbing were the reports of healers who appeared to be impossibly old, describing events from decades past with the intimacy of first-hand experience. Patients would find themselves speaking with women who remembered treating their grandparents, who could describe family illnesses and tragedies spanning multiple generations. These healers seemed to carry within themselves the accumulated memories of everyone they had ever treated, creating a collective consciousness of pain and healing that transcended individual identity. The Thornton Cole dynasty had transformed into something that defied conventional understanding of corporate structure. Eleanor Thornton's conversion to renewable energy had been remarkably successful, but the company's expansion into solar and wind power came with the same supernatural elements that had characterized their mining operations. Thornton Energy's solar farms produced efficiency rates that exceeded the theoretical maximum output for their equipment, generating power levels that should have been impossible given the available sunlight and technology. The company's wind farms demonstrated similar anomalies. Turbines would continue generating electricity even when weather conditions showed no measurable wind. Maintenance crews reported that the turbines seemed to be drawing power from sources that their instruments couldn't detect, creating energy from environmental factors that didn't register on any known measuring devices. The sanctuary shafts that had been central to the family's mining operations had been converted into what company documents described as geothermal monitoring stations. But the temperature readings from these sites defied geological understanding. The shafts registered consistent thermal output that suggested heat sources far deeper and more intense than the region's geology could support. More puzzling were the seasonal variations in these readings, which seemed to correlate with lunar cycles rather than any known geothermal patterns. Eleanor Thornton's annual descents into these converted shafts had become more elaborate over time. Security footage from the facilities showed her bringing increasingly complex equipment, containers of various sizes, electronic devices that didn't match any known technology, and bundles of organic material that appeared to be carefully preserved plant specimens. She would emerge from these sessions with her hair turned completely white, though it would return to its natural color within days. The most unsettling development was the discovery that Thornton Energy's power grid seemed to be connected to something beyond conventional electrical infrastructure. During regional blackouts, areas served by Thornton Power would continue receiving electricity even when the company's generation facilities were offline. Investigation revealed that the power was somehow being drawn from the sanctuary shafts themselves, as though the deep tunnels had become conduits for energy that originated from sources far below the Earth's surface. The Whitaker musical legacy had evolved into something that challenged the very nature of artistic expression. While the family had retreated from public performance, their influence on music had expanded through digital channels that seemed to operate independently of human control. Streaming platforms worldwide reported the spontaneous appearance of Whitaker compositions, tracks that would materialize in users' playlists without any record of how they had been uploaded or who held the rights to the music. These digital manifestations possessed qualities that defied technical explanation. The files seemed to be self-modifying, changing slightly with each listening while maintaining the same fundamental structure. Audio engineers who attempted to analyze the compositions found that the music contained frequencies that shouldn't have been possible to record or reproduce, sounds that seemed to exist in the spaces between normal auditory perception. More disturbing were the reports from listeners who became obsessed with these mysterious tracks. Users would find themselves listening to the same Whitaker composition repeatedly, sometimes for hours at a time, describing the experience as being unable to turn off the music even when they wanted to. The compositions seemed to trigger a form of auditory addiction, creating neural pathways that craved the specific harmonic progressions and rhythmic patterns that characterized Whitaker music. The abandoned Whitaker compound in the Appalachian Highlands had become a site of pilgrimage for musicians seeking to understand the source of this otherworldly music. Visitors reported hearing elaborate orchestral performances echoing through the valleys, compositions that seemed to be performed by far more instruments than any human ensemble could manage. Recording equipment brought to the site would capture only static, but the human ear could detect melodies of impossible complexity and beauty. The most chilling discovery came from musicologists who had studied the family's history. They found evidence that the Whitaker gift had been spreading beyond the original bloodline through a form of musical transmission. Musicians who performed Whitaker compositions, even from sheet music or recordings, would begin to develop the same physical characteristics that had marked the original family. Their fingers would elongate, their hearing would become painfully acute, and their pupils would dilate in rhythm with nearby sounds. These secondary carriers of the Whitaker gift reported the same visitations that had plagued the original family. They described dreams of the composer, an entity that appeared as a constantly shifting figure, playing instruments that seemed to be made of shadow and light. The composer would teach them new compositions, melodies that contained mathematical relationships, so complex that they seemed to alter the listener's perception of reality itself. The true horror of these 5 families lies not in their historical crimes, but in their ongoing influence. The bargains struck in desperation over a century ago had created ongoing relationships with entities that exist beyond human understanding. These forces had learned to adapt their methods to modern times, finding new ways to extract payment from human communities while offering the same promises of prosperity and power that had originally tempted the families into their unholy agreements. The descendants of these bloodlines continue to carry the marks of their ancestors' choices, but the influence has spread far beyond the original family trees. The entities that once demanded blood sacrifices in remote mountain caves now harvest human energy through corporate structures, digital platforms, and modern infrastructure. The coal that once required monthly tributes of human life now powers cities through renewable energy sources that draw from the same otherworldly forces that had inhabited the deep shafts. The pattern is always the same. Desperation leads to bargains, bargains lead to prosperity, and prosperity demands an ever-increasing price. The mountains that once sheltered these families now serve as conduits for influences that reach far beyond Appalachian communities. The old hungers have learned to feed through modern networks, spreading their influence through digital systems and corporate structures that connect to every corner of contemporary life. In the end, the deadliest aspect of these Appalachian families isn't their capacity for violence or their willingness to sacrifice others for their own gain. It's their demonstration that certain bargains, once made, become permanent features of the human experience. The entities they invited into our world through their desperate deals have never left, and they continue to seek new partnerships with those willing to trade their humanity for temporary advantage. The mountains still whisper their ancient promises to anyone desperate enough to listen, and in our modern world of economic uncertainty and social upheaval, there are always those willing to venture into the darkness, seeking solutions that come with prices they don't yet understand. The folklore collection began in 1952 when anthropologist Dr. Margaret Winters arrived in eastern Kentucky to document traditional mountain customs. What she discovered would haunt her for the rest of her life. Hidden among the expected stories of healing women and conjure work were accounts of 5 families whose practices defied rational explanation. Each family had developed supernatural traditions that persisted across generations, traditions that local historians refused to document officially. Dr. Winters spent 18 months gathering testimonies from elderly residents, former family members who had fled their bloodlines, and witnesses who spoke only in hushed tones. Her field notes, sealed in university archives until 1987, reveal a disturbing pattern. Each family had established their otherworldly power through a specific ritual, and each paid an ongoing price that grew more terrible with each generation. The Drayton family of Widows Hollow practiced what they called the Communion of Shadows. Beginning in 1843, they established a tradition of inviting entities from beyond the veil to inhabit their family members during carefully orchestrated ceremonies. The ritual took place in their root cellar, a chamber carved directly into the mountain bedrock and lined with stones arranged in precise geometric patterns. Every full moon, the family would gather in this underground sanctum. The eldest member would light candles made from fat, rendered from animals found dead without apparent cause. As the flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, family members would begin a chant passed down through generations. The words weren't English, nor did they resemble any known Appalachian dialect. Linguists, who later studied recorded fragments, described the language as impossibly ancient, with tonal qualities that seemed to bypass human hearing and resonate directly in the listener's chest. During these ceremonies, the shadows in the chamber would begin moving independently of their sources. Participants reported feeling invisible presences circling them, whispering secrets in their ears, sharing knowledge that no living person should possess. The Draytons claimed these entities revealed the location of hidden treasures, warned of impending dangers, and provided supernatural protection for their family line. The price for this communion became apparent within 2 generations. Drayton children began exhibiting disturbing behaviors. They spoke to empty corners, played games with invisible companions, and demonstrated knowledge of events happening miles away. More troubling, they aged in reverse patterns. While their bodies matured normally, their minds seemed to regress, becoming increasingly childlike even as they reached adulthood. By the 1890s, the Drayton family had become something barely recognizable as human. Neighbors reported seeing them walking through the forest at night, their movements too fluid, too coordinated, as if controlled by a single intelligence. Their eyes reflected light like nocturnal animals, and their voices carried harmonics that made listeners feel nauseated. The family's influence extended beyond their immediate bloodline. Other residents of Widow's Hollow began experiencing shared nightmares, visions of shadowy figures beckoning them into the forest. Several families abandoned their homesteads, leaving behind all their possessions rather than remain in the valley. Those who stayed reported that their livestock refused to graze in certain areas, and their hunting dogs would howl inconsolably on nights when the moon was full. The Drayton's final ceremony took place during the winter solstice of 1901. According to the sole survivor, a cousin who had been visiting from Virginia, the ritual began as usual, but something went terribly wrong. The shadows didn't just move independently, they began consuming the participants. One by one, family members were engulfed by darkness, their screams echoing through the chamber until only silence remained. When dawn broke, the cousin emerged from the cellar to find the homestead completely empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty clothes arranged in perfect circles throughout the house. The shadows themselves seemed wrong, too dark, too deep, as if they contained depths that shouldn't exist in a two-dimensional space. The Drayton property remains uninhabited to this day. Local real estate records show the land has been sold 17 times since 1901, but no buyer has ever remained longer than 6 months. Each departure follows the same pattern. Residents report feeling watched, experience vivid nightmares, and eventually flee after discovering shadow figures in their photographs that weren't visible when the pictures were taken. The Merrick family of Bone Ridge developed their supernatural abilities through a practice they called bloodweaving. Unlike other families who sought power through external entities, the Merricks believed they could enhance their own natural abilities by literally sharing their life force with one another. Their ritual began in 1856 when Patriarch Ezra Merrick, a former ship's surgeon, adapted medical knowledge to create what he called a living network. Using techniques borrowed from battlefield medicine, he connected family members through a series of carefully placed cuts and specially prepared tubes that allowed their blood to flow from one person to another during monthly ceremonies. The Merricks constructed a specialized chamber in their barn where family members would lie on wooden tables arranged in a star pattern. Ezra would make precise incisions in each participant's arms and connect them with hollow reeds harvested from a particular marsh where, according to local legend, Cherokee medicine men had once performed their own blood rituals. As their blood mingled and flowed between them, the Merricks reported experiencing a collective consciousness. They could share thoughts, emotions, and memories across vast distances. One family member could taste food being eaten by another miles away. They developed an uncanny ability to predict each other's actions and coordinate complex tasks without verbal communication. The enhanced abilities extended beyond mere telepathy. The Merricks became preternaturally skilled at tracking, hunting, and surviving in the wilderness. They could navigate in complete darkness, predict weather patterns days in advance, and locate water sources in the driest seasons. Their success as hunter and trappers brought them considerable wealth, but also attracted unwanted attention from those who wondered how they consistently outperformed more experienced woodsmen. However, the blood-weaving ritual came with a terrible cost. The shared consciousness meant that trauma experienced by one family member was felt by all. When young Sarah Merrick died in a hunting accident in 1873, her death throes were experienced simultaneously by every connected family member. The psychological trauma was so severe that 3 relatives died within days, apparently from the shock of experiencing death while remaining alive. More disturbing was the gradual loss of individual identity. As the ritual continued across generations, family members began losing their sense of self. They spoke in unison, moved in perfect synchronization, and seemed to share a single personality distributed across multiple bodies. Children born into the family never developed independent thoughts or preferences, instead immediately integrating into the collective consciousness. By 1895, the Merrick family had become something resembling a hive mind. They functioned as a single organism with multiple bodies, their individual personalities completely subsumed into the collective. When one family member was injured, all would feel the pain. When one was hungry, all would eat. When one died, all would mourn with an intensity that often proved fatal. The family's unity became their downfall when an influenza epidemic struck the region in 1918. The shared consciousness meant that the illness spread instantaneously through their psychic connection, killing all 18 family members within a single day. Their bodies were found arranged in the star pattern of their ritual chamber, their hands reaching toward the center, where a bowl of their mingled blood had turned black and thick as tar. The Kesler family of Raven's Roost practiced what they called the feeding of the hollow ones. Their supernatural bargain involved maintaining a colony of entities that resembled enormous insects, creatures that local folklore described as having been trapped in the mountain caves since before human settlement. The Keslers discovered these beings in 1851 when Patriarch Johann Kesler, a German immigrant, explored a series of limestone caves while searching for shelter during a severe thunderstorm. Deep within the mountain, he found a vast chamber filled with creatures that defied description. They possessed characteristics of both insects and something else entirely, with chitinous shells that gleamed like black mirrors and appendages that moved in ways that hurt to observe directly. Rather than fleeing, Johann approached the creatures with offerings of food from his pack. To his amazement, they accepted his gifts and seemed to communicate through a series of clicks and vibrations that resonated through the cave walls. Over several visits, he learned to interpret their alien language and discovered they were willing to share their supernatural abilities in exchange for regular feeding. The Hollow Ones, as the Keslers came to call them, possessed the ability to manipulate reality in subtle but profound ways. They could cause crops to grow in impossible conditions, make structures more durable than engineering should allow, and grant their human partners enhanced strength and endurance. In return, they required a specific type of sustenance that Johann learned to provide through careful preparation. The feeding ritual involved collecting organic materials from across the mountain, animals that had died of natural causes, plants harvested during specific lunar phases, and soil from areas where lightning had struck. These materials were combined with contributions from the Kesler family themselves, nail clippings, hair, and small amounts of blood, creating a mixture that the Hollow Ones found irresistible. As the arrangement continued, the Keslers prospered beyond their wildest dreams. Their crops never failed, their livestock never sickened, and their buildings withstood storms that destroyed neighboring homesteads. They became known throughout the region for their uncanny ability to predict weather patterns and their seemingly supernatural luck in all endeavors. However, the Hollow One's hunger grew with each feeding. What began as monthly offerings became weekly, then daily requirements. The creatures began demanding more exotic sustenance, materials that were increasingly difficult to obtain. The Keslers found themselves traveling farther and farther from home, sometimes engaging in activities that bordered on grave robbing to satisfy their supernatural partners. More troubling was the gradual transformation of the family members themselves. Prolonged exposure to the Hollow Ones began affecting their physical appearance. Their skin took on a chitinous quality, their eyes developed additional pupils, and their movements became unnaturally precise and coordinated. Children born into the family emerged with appendages that resembled the creature's own limbs, abnormalities that were carefully hidden from outsiders. The relationship reached its inevitable conclusion in 1889, when the Hollow One's hunger could no longer be satisfied by conventional offerings. They began demanding living sacrifices, first animals, then eventually human beings. When Johann's grandson refused to provide what they requested, the creatures emerged from their cave for the first time in decades. Local residents reported seeing impossible shapes moving through the forest, shadows that moved wrong, and sounds that made their teeth ache. The Kesler homestead was found empty, with signs of a struggle that suggested the family had been dragged back into the mountain caves. The Hollow Ones disappeared as well, though some locals claim that on the darkest nights, strange lights can still be seen emanating from the deep caves of Raven's Roost. The Caldwell family of Misty Hollow developed their supernatural abilities through a practice they called the borrowing of years. Unlike other families who sought power through external entities or shared consciousness, the Caldwells discovered a way to manipulate time itself, extending their own lifespans by stealing years from others. The practice began in 1867 when matriarch Constance Caldwell, a midwife known for her uncanny ability to predict which mothers would survive childbirth, stumbled upon a ritual described in a journal she found hidden in the walls of an abandoned cabin. The journal, written in a mixture of English and symbols that resembled no known language, detailed a process for transferring life force from one person to another. The ritual required careful preparation and precise timing. During the new moon, when the veil between worlds was thinnest, the Caldwells would lure visitors to their isolated homestead. Using a combination of hospitality and subtle manipulation, they would convince guests to participate in what they described as a traditional mountain blessing ceremony. The ceremony took place in a specially prepared room where the walls were covered with mirrors salvaged from abandoned houses throughout the region. The Caldwells claimed these mirrors had been blessed by Cherokee medicine men, though the truth was far more sinister. Each mirror had been taken from a home where someone had died, and the Caldwells believed they contained fragments of the deceased's remaining life force. During the ritual, guests would be positioned in the center of the room while family members formed a circle around them. The Caldwells would begin a chant that seemed to make the mirrors vibrate, their surfaces rippling like water despite being solid glass. As the ceremony progressed, participants reported feeling increasingly drowsy, as if their energy was being slowly drained away. The Caldwells claimed they were simply conducting a purification ritual that would bring their guests good fortune. In reality, they were siphoning years from their victims' lives, transferring that stolen time to themselves. The process was so gradual that guests rarely noticed anything amiss until days or weeks later, when they began experiencing rapid aging, memory loss, and a general decline in health. The family's supernatural longevity became apparent over time. While neighbors aged normally, the Caldwells remained remarkably youthful. Constance, who should have been in her 70s by 1900, appeared to be no older than 40. Her children, who should have been elderly, looked like they were in their prime. The family explained their youthful appearance as a result of clean mountain living and herbal remedies, but suspicious neighbors began avoiding their homestead. The Caldwells' practice required a constant supply of victims, leading them to become increasingly predatory in their approach. They began targeting travelers, peddlers, and anyone who might not be immediately missed. Their homestead became known as a place where people entered but didn't always leave, though the disappearances were so gradual and the victims so carefully chosen that no pattern was immediately apparent. The family's downfall came when they attempted to drain the years from a child who possessed unusual sensitivity to supernatural forces. During the ritual, the young victim began screaming about seeing dead faces in the mirrors, faces of all the previous people whose life force had been stolen. The child's terror was so intense that it shattered several mirrors, releasing what the Caldwells claimed were the trapped souls of their victims. The freed spirits turned on their tormentors with a vengeance that defied description. Family members began aging rapidly, decades of stolen time catching up with them in a matter of hours. Their bodies withered and crumbled as their borrowed years were reclaimed by forces beyond their understanding. Within a single night, the entire Caldwell line was reduced to dust, leaving only their empty clothes and the shattered mirrors that had been their instruments of theft. The Grayson family of Devil's Backbone practiced the most disturbing tradition of all, something they called the cultivation of hunger. Their supernatural abilities stemmed from a deliberate embrace of an ancient force that fed on human suffering, an entity they referred to only as the Hollow King. The practice began in 1874 when Samuel Grayson, a former Union soldier haunted by battlefield memories, discovered a series of caves that contained evidence of pre-Columbian rituals. The cave walls were covered with pictographs depicting human figures bowing before a massive shadow that seemed to devour light itself. Among the ancient artifacts, Samuel found a collection of obsidian implements and instructions carved in stone that described a ritual for summoning and binding the Hollow King. Desperate to find relief from his war trauma, Samuel performed the ritual during the winter solstice. The ceremony required him to inflict specific wounds on himself using the obsidian tools, allowing his blood to flow into channels carved in the cave floor. As his life force seeped into the stone, he began experiencing visions of the Hollow King, an entity of pure hunger that existed in the spaces between thoughts. The Hollow King offered Samuel a bargain. In exchange for regular feeding, it would consume his traumatic memories and grant him supernatural abilities. The price was that Samuel would need to provide the entity with a constant supply of human suffering, emotions, and experiences that the Hollow King found particularly nourishing. Samuel accepted the bargain and returned to his family with newfound purpose. He began systematically orchestrating situations that would generate the types of suffering the Hollow King craved. He would spread rumors that turned neighbors against each other, manipulate financial situations to create desperation, and engineer accidents that resulted in tragedy. Each act of suffering he caused was absorbed by the Hollow King, which in turn granted the Grayson family enhanced abilities. The Graysons developed supernatural charisma that allowed them to manipulate others with ease. They could sense people's deepest fears and desires, using this knowledge to exploit and control those around them. Their ability to cause suffering became increasingly sophisticated as they learned to orchestrate complex scenarios that would maximize the emotional pain they could harvest. The family's influence spread throughout the region as they established themselves as prominent citizens while secretly feeding their supernatural patron. They became successful merchants, respected community leaders, and trusted advisors, all while systematically destroying the lives of those around them. The Hollow King's hunger grew with each feeding, demanding increasingly elaborate forms of suffering. The Graysons began targeting entire families, orchestrating multi-generational tragedies that would provide sustained nourishment for their patron. They would arrange marriages between incompatible partners, manipulate inheritance disputes, and create situations that would result in cycles of revenge and hatred lasting decades. Their ability to cause suffering became so refined that they could engineer tragedies that appeared completely natural while maximizing the emotional devastation they produced. The family's practices continued until 1923, when they made the mistake of targeting a family that included a member with supernatural sensitivity. This individual recognized the Graysons' influence and began documenting their activities, eventually gathering enough evidence to expose their systematic manipulation of the community. When confronted by an angry mob of their victims, the Graysons retreated to their cave sanctuary to perform a final ritual. Rather than face justice, they chose to offer themselves as an ultimate sacrifice to the Hollow King, believing it would grant them immortality. The ritual went terribly wrong, as the Hollow King, glutted on decades of suffering, had grown beyond their ability to control. The entity consumed not just their bodies, but their very existence, erasing them so completely that even their names were forgotten by those who had known them. The caves where they had performed their rituals collapsed, sealing the Hollow King's prison once again. However, local residents report that the area around Devil's Backbone remains unnaturally quiet, as if the very landscape remembers the suffering that once fed an ancient hunger. These 5 families represent the darkest aspects of Appalachian folklore, traditions that were deliberately hidden from mainstream historical documentation. Their practices reveal the terrible costs of seeking supernatural power through desperation and the dangers of making bargains with forces beyond human understanding. While their bloodlines have ended, their influence continues to shape the mountain communities where they once lived, serving as warnings about the price of power and the persistence of ancient hungers that still wait in the shadows of the oldest mountains. Now, we need to understand how these families' influence spread beyond their isolated mountain settlements. The true horror of the Appalachian supernatural bloodlines wasn't just their individual practices, but how they created an interconnected web of power that reached far beyond the misty hollows where they originated. The descendants of these cursed families didn't simply vanish into mountain folklore. They adapted, evolved, and found new ways to maintain their otherworldly advantages in a rapidly changing world. By the 1920s, as America modernized and mountain communities connected to the outside world, these families faced a choice: abandon their supernatural bargains or find new ways to honor ancient contracts. The holy mining legacy transformed into something far more sophisticated than simple coal extraction. Their descendants established what became known as the Cumberland Energy Consortium, a network of companies that controlled mineral rights across 7 states. But their real power lay in their ability to sense underground resources that geological surveys couldn't detect. Modern family members still possess that uncanny night vision and subterranean awareness their ancestors had developed. Corporate executives who worked with Cumberland Energy reported strange experiences during site inspections. Equipment would malfunction in specific locations, only to reveal incredibly valuable deposits once the family members arrived. Board meetings were held in conference rooms with no windows, and the family representatives always insisted on conducting business after sunset. The most disturbing element was their continued tribute system. Every major mining operation still experienced exactly one fatal accident per lunar cycle, though now these incidents were carefully documented as equipment failures or human error. Insurance companies eventually stopped investigating Cumberland Energy accidents, claiming their reports were always mysteriously incomplete or contained data that didn't match physical evidence. Current employees describe a culture where certain underground areas remain strictly off limits, marked only with small metal plaques bearing symbols that don't appear in any engineering manual. Night shift workers report hearing rhythmic tapping from sealed sections of mines, and some claim to have seen figures moving through tunnels that company blueprints show as solid rock. The Carver timber fortune evolved into something even more sinister. Their descendants now control Appalachian Sustainable Forestry, a corporation that manages over 2 million acres of woodland across the eastern United States. Their success in reforestation projects defies scientific explanation, with growth rates that forestry experts cannot replicate. What makes their modern operations particularly unsettling is their employment practices. The company exclusively hires from families with multi-generational ties to Appalachian communities, and employee contracts include unusual clauses about family medical history and the number of children each worker has. Human Resources maintains detailed genealogical records going back centuries, information that has no apparent business purpose. Park rangers and environmental scientists working near Appalachian sustainable forestry properties report strange phenomena. Trees grow in unnatural patterns, forming circles or spirals that are visible only from aerial photography. Wildlife populations in these areas show unusual behavior, with predator species avoiding certain groves entirely, while deer and smaller animals gather in numbers that should exceed the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. Most troubling are the children's camps the company sponsors throughout the region. Every summer, they offer free wilderness education programs for local youth, particularly targeting families facing economic hardship. Parents describe their children returning from these camps with improved outdoor skills, but also with new nightmares and an inexplicable reluctance to discuss their experiences. The psychological impact extends beyond the participants. Counselors at these camps rarely work more than one season, and several have sought therapy for what they describe as persistent feelings of being watched while in forested areas. Some report dreams of children walking into the woods at night, following voices that call to them in languages that sound almost familiar but can't be understood. The Lowel healing tradition found new expression in the modern healthcare system. Their descendants established the Cumberland Alternative Medicine Institute, a network of clinics that offer treatments conventional medicine cannot explain. Patients travel from across the country seeking help for conditions that traditional hospitals have declared incurable. The Institute's success rates are unprecedented, but their treatment protocols remain strictly confidential. Patients must sign agreements preventing them from discussing their experiences or sharing details about their therapy. Medical boards have attempted to investigate the Institute's practices, but their files are always mysteriously incomplete, and investigators often abandon their inquiries without explanation. Healthcare workers who've tried to study the Institute's methods report experiencing vivid dreams where they witness ancient healing rituals. Some describe feeling compelled to visit specific locations in the Cumberland Mountains, where they find themselves drawn to caves or clearings they've never seen before but somehow recognize. The most disturbing aspect of the Institute's operations is their patient selection process. They accept cases based on criteria that have nothing to do with medical need or ability to pay. Instead, they require detailed family histories and conduct interviews that focus on personal tragedies, losses, and emotional wounds. Many patients report feeling as though the intake process was designed to catalog their suffering rather than assess their medical condition. The Thornton coal empire seamlessly transitioned into renewable energy, but their supernatural advantages remained intact. Thornton Energy now operates solar farms and wind installations that produce efficiency rates competitors cannot match. Their turbines generate power even when meteorological conditions suggest insufficient wind, and their solar panels maintain peak output during overcast conditions. Environmental monitoring stations near Thornton Energy facilities record anomalous readings that equipment manufacturers cannot explain. Electromagnetic fields fluctuate in patterns that don't correspond to any known energy production process, and infrared cameras occasionally capture heat signatures that suggest underground activity in areas where no machinery operates. The company's research and development division occupies a facility built directly over the original mine shafts, where the family's supernatural bargain began. Employees in this division sign the most restrictive non-disclosure agreements in the energy industry, and turnover rates are unusually high. Former workers describe a workplace culture where certain areas of the building are accessible only to family members, and where the executive floor contains rooms with no apparent purpose except to house objects that predate the company's founding. Most significantly, the Thornton family's respiratory ailments have evolved into something that medical science struggles to categorize. Current family members don't die from lung disease. Instead, they experience what company medical records describe as energy integration syndrome. Their breathing becomes synchronized with the fluctuations of their renewable energy systems, and their life expectancy appears to be tied to the operational capacity of their power generation facilities. The Whitaker musical legacy found new expression in the digital age, but their supernatural gift carried over in ways that technology cannot explain. Their descendants now control several music streaming services and audio engineering companies, and their influence on the industry extends far beyond business success. Musicians who work with Whitaker-affiliated companies report experiencing creative breakthroughs that feel more like possession than inspiration. They describe sessions where melodies seem to emerge from the recording equipment itself and where harmonies develop that no human voice should be able to produce. Some artists become so dependent on these supernatural enhancements that they cannot perform without Whitaker family members present. The most disturbing development is the emergence of what audio engineers call phantom frequencies in recordings produced by Whitaker companies. These are sounds that exist only in the digital realm, patterns that listeners perceive but that cannot be isolated or analyzed. People who listen to these recordings report shared experiences, dreams of mountain landscapes they've never visited, memories of songs they've never heard, and an inexplicable urge to travel to specific locations in the Appalachian Mountains. Music therapists working with Whitaker-produced content have documented cases where patients experience what they describe as inherited nostalgia, emotional responses to melodies that seem to trigger memories from before their birth. Some report feeling as though they're remembering experiences that belong to ancestors they never knew, particularly related to mountain communities and traditional folk practices. The interconnected nature of these family networks became apparent only in recent decades, as genealogical research and digital record keeping revealed the extent of their influence. Marriage records show that the five families have been intermarrying for generations, creating bloodlines that carry multiple supernatural gifts. Corporate filings reveal business partnerships that span industries but always involve the same family names. Government agencies that have attempted to investigate these connections find their research hampered by missing records, corrupted databases, and the sudden transfer of key personnel to other assignments. Congressional inquiries into the family's business practices have been quietly abandoned, and journalists who pursue these stories often find their editors reassigning them to other topics without explanation. The most chilling evidence of their continued influence lies in the regional statistics for the areas under their control. Appalachian counties, dominated by their businesses, show anomalous patterns in everything from birth rates to psychological health metrics. Missing persons reports in these areas are processed differently, with search and rescue operations often called off earlier than standard protocols would suggest. Local law enforcement in these regions operates under informal agreements that certain areas remain off limits to routine patrols. Officers describe receiving training about environmental hazards and unstable geological conditions that require special authorization to investigate. These restricted zones always correspond to locations where the original families conducted their supernatural practices. The digital age has created new opportunities for these families to extend their influence. Social media algorithms seem to favor content produced by their companies, and their streaming services show unusual user engagement patterns. People report discovering playlists they didn't create, containing music that triggers strong emotional responses and dreams of mountain landscapes. Most disturbing is the emergence of what researchers call digital hauntings connected to these families' online presence. Users who interact with their content report experiencing technical malfunctions that seem purposeful rather than random. Smartphones display images that weren't photographed. Audio recordings contain voices that weren't present during the recording, and GPS systems direct users to locations that don't appear on any map. The psychological impact extends to the families themselves. Modern descendants carry the weight of their ancestors' bargains in ways that manifest as both privilege and curse. They possess abilities that give them enormous advantages in business and life, but they also bear the hereditary costs of supernatural contracts they didn't personally negotiate. Many describe feeling as though they're living lives that aren't entirely their own, making decisions influenced by inherited memories and impulses they don't fully understand. Some report dreams where they witness their ancestors' original supernatural encounters, experiencing the fear and desperation that led to those fateful bargains. The most troubling aspect of these modern manifestations is their expansion beyond the original families. Employees, business partners, and even customers of their companies report experiencing supernatural phenomena that suggest the family's otherworldly connections are spreading to new bloodlines. Some describe feeling watched by unseen presences. Others report dreams of underground chambers and mountain clearings they've never visited. The boundaries between the supernatural and the mundane have become increasingly blurred as these families adapt their ancient practices to modern circumstances. Their influence now extends through corporate boardrooms, government agencies, and digital networks, creating a web of supernatural power that touches millions of lives. What began as desperate bargains made by isolated mountain families has evolved into something far more complex and far-reaching. The entities they originally contacted haven't forgotten their contracts, and the prices they demanded continue to be paid by successive generations. But now those costs are distributed across a much wider population, as the family's influence spreads through the interconnected systems of modern society. The true scope of their power remains hidden behind layers of corporate structure, legal protection, and technological complexity. But for those who know what to look for, the signs are everywhere, in the patterns of missing persons reports, in the anomalous readings from environmental monitoring stations, in the shared dreams of people who've never met but somehow remember the same mountain landscapes. The ancient hungers that once lurked in isolated Appalachian hollows have found new ways to feed, and their appetite has grown far beyond what their original human partners could have imagined. The bargains continue, the prices are still being paid, and the influence of these supernatural bloodlines continues to spread through the veins of modern America like a slow-acting poison that transforms everything it touches. These mountains hold secrets that most folks never learn about, and for good reason. The 5 families we've explored so far made their bargains with forces beyond human understanding, trading their humanity for prosperity, power, and influence. But what happens when those ancient contracts come due? What happens when the debts accumulated over generations finally demand their payment? The answer lies in the modern era, where these bloodlines have evolved their practices, adapting supernatural power to contemporary systems. They've learned to hide their true nature behind corporate boardrooms, digital networks, and technological innovations. But the hunger remains the same, and the methods have only grown more sophisticated. The Holloway Mining Corporation never truly disappeared after that 1928 collapse. Instead, it transformed into something more insidious. By the 1950s, the company had reorganized under new management, though locals whispered that the same pale-skinned individuals who resembled the original Holloway children were seen in executive positions. The corporation diversified beyond coal, acquiring interests in rare earth minerals, lithium extraction, and eventually data storage facilities. The most disturbing development came in the 1990s when Holloway Mining established a series of underground server farms in their former coal territories. These facilities, marketed as secure data centers for major tech companies, were built directly over the old mining networks. Employees reported the same phenomena that had plagued the original miners: equipment that repaired itself overnight, productivity that surged during lunar cycles, and the persistent sound of rhythmic tapping from sealed chambers. More troubling was the discovery that these data centers experienced unusually high rates of employee burnout, with workers reporting vivid nightmares and an inexplicable compulsion to remain underground for extended periods. Several employees disappeared entirely, their security badges found arranged in ritual patterns near the deepest server rooms. Investigation revealed that the servers themselves were processing far more data than their specifications should allow, as though something was amplifying their capabilities from within the mountain itself. The Holloway Corporation's current operations extend far beyond simple data storage. They've become integral to the infrastructure of social media platforms, financial networks, and government databases. Every transaction processed through their systems, every piece of personal data stored in their servers, feeds something that dwells in the depths of those abandoned mine shafts. The entity that once demanded monthly blood sacrifices now feeds on digital information, harvesting the personal details, fears, and desires of millions of users. Recent investigations by tech journalists have uncovered disturbing patterns in the data processed by Holloway facilities. User behavior mysteriously shifts after their information passes through these servers, with people reporting sudden urges to make poor financial decisions, relationship changes, and unexplained periods of depression. The corporation's terms of service contain clauses written in archaic language that few lawyers can properly interpret, but digital rights advocates believe these contracts grant the company unprecedented access to users' personal lives. The Carver timber dynasty evolved similarly, transitioning from traditional logging to what they now call sustainable forestry management. Carver Industries became a major player in the paper industry, then publishing, and eventually digital media. They own several major news outlets, publishing houses, and streaming platforms, all unified by a disturbing common thread: content that subtly influences viewers toward desperation and poor decision making. The company's headquarters, built on the site of the original Cursed Grove, houses one of the most advanced content creation facilities in the world. Writers, directors, and producers work in conditions that maximize creative output while slowly draining their personal lives. The facility's design incorporates the same circular patterns found in the original Grove, with workstations arranged in concentric rings around a central conference room that employees are forbidden to enter. Former employees describe the company's creative process as unnaturally efficient. Writers complete scripts in impossibly short time frames, directors achieve perfect shots on first takes, and actors deliver performances that seem to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to viewers' subconscious minds. The content produced by Carver Industries consistently drives audiences toward specific behaviors: increased consumption, social isolation, and most importantly, the belief that their problems can be solved through desperate bargains. The company's most successful productions share common elements: protagonists who achieve success through morally questionable means, storylines that normalize the idea of trading essential aspects of humanity for material gain, and endings that suggest such bargains are not only acceptable but inevitable. These themes are woven so subtly into the content that viewers absorb them without conscious awareness, creating a generation primed to make the same mistakes as the original Mountain families. Marketing analysis reveals that Carver Industries' content performs exceptionally well in regions experiencing economic hardship, family breakdown, or social isolation. The company's algorithms specifically target individuals showing signs of desperation, serving them content designed to erode their resistance to supernatural solutions. Their streaming platform's recommendation system has been accused of creating despair spirals, where users are systematically exposed to increasingly dark content until they reach a psychological breaking point. The Lowel family's healing tradition has perhaps undergone the most sophisticated evolution. The Lower Medical Group now operates a network of wellness clinics, pharmaceutical research facilities, and digital health platforms that extend their influence globally. Their approach combines traditional medicine with cutting-edge technology, creating treatments that are genuinely effective while secretly extracting a different kind of payment from patients. The family's medical facilities are marvels of modern architecture designed to promote healing while incorporating subtle elements that facilitate their ancient practices. Waiting rooms feature art containing hypnotic patterns, flooring incorporates materials from the original Cumberland Gap healing sites, and ventilation systems circulate air infused with compounds derived from the herbs their ancestors used in their supernatural treatments. Patients treated at Lowel facilities experience remarkable recoveries, but follow-up studies reveal troubling long-term effects. Many report persistent nightmares, unexplained periods of empathy so intense it becomes debilitating, and a compulsion to seek out others who are suffering. The family's healing gift has evolved into a form of emotional vampirism, where they cure physical ailments by distributing the associated suffering across a network of former patients. The corporation's pharmaceutical division has developed several breakthrough medications that work by mechanisms scientists cannot fully explain. These drugs show remarkable efficacy in clinical trials, but contain compounds that create subtle dependencies, not on the medication itself, but on the act of healing others. Patients find themselves drawn to volunteer work, caregiving professions, and social activism, unknowingly serving as distribution nodes for the family's supernatural healing network. Most disturbing is the company's digital health platform, which monitors users' physical and emotional states through smartphone sensors, wearable devices, and social media analysis. The platform claims to provide personalized wellness recommendations, but analysis of its algorithms reveals a more sinister purpose: identifying individuals experiencing peak suffering and connecting them with the family's healing network. Users report that the app seems to know about their problems before they're fully conscious of them, offering solutions that provide immediate relief while binding them to the family's supernatural ecosystem. The Thornton energy empire has become one of the most powerful forces in the renewable energy sector, though their success continues to depend on the same dark bargains their ancestors made. Thornton Energy Solutions operates wind farms, solar installations, and experimental fusion reactors, all of which produce energy outputs that exceed theoretical maximums. Their technology appears to violate fundamental laws of physics, generating more power than the fuel consumed should allow. The company's research facilities are built over the original sanctuary shafts, which have been expanded into vast underground complexes. These facilities supposedly house experimental reactors, but employees report phenomena that suggest something far more unusual. Equipment operates without apparent power sources. Temperature fluctuations follow patterns that correspond to lunar cycles, and the complex's deepest levels are accessible only to family members who undergo monthly maintenance procedures. Investigation of the company's energy production reveals that their facilities consistently outperform competitors by margins that should be impossible. Solar panels manufactured by Thornton subsidiaries achieve efficiency rates that violate the theoretical limits of photovoltaic technology. Their wind turbines generate power even in completely still air, and their experimental fusion reactors produce energy signatures that don't match any known nuclear processes. The most disturbing aspect of Thornton's operations is their approach to site selection. The company acquires land for new facilities based on criteria that have nothing to do with traditional energy considerations. They seek locations with specific geological features, proximity to underground water sources, and historical significance that often relates to indigenous sacred sites or locations of unexplained disappearances. Once construction begins, these sites experience dramatic increases in supernatural activity, with local wildlife fleeing the area and nearby communities reporting shared nightmares. The Whitaker musical legacy has evolved into a multimedia empire that influences global culture through record labels, streaming platforms, and entertainment technology. Whitaker Entertainment Group controls several major music labels, owns significant stakes in streaming services, and has developed audio technology that creates unprecedented emotional responses in listeners. Their influence extends beyond music into film scoring, video game audio, and even therapeutic sound applications. The company's recording studios are acoustically perfect, achieving sound quality that audio engineers describe as supernatural. Musicians report that recording in these facilities enhances their abilities beyond their natural limits, allowing them to create music that seems to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to listeners' emotional centers. However, artists who work extensively with Whitaker facilities often experience the same psychological deterioration that plagued the original family members, becoming increasingly isolated and obsessed with impossible musical concepts. The corporation's streaming algorithms show unusual sophistication in predicting user preferences, often recommending music that listeners didn't know they wanted to hear. Analysis reveals that these recommendations are based on emotional states rather than traditional musical preferences, with the platform serving content designed to intensify whatever emotional state the user is experiencing. Happy listeners receive music that creates euphoria, while sad listeners are fed content that deepens their depression, creating emotional extremes that make users more susceptible to the supernatural influences embedded in Whitaker productions. Most concerning is the company's development of therapeutic audio applications that claim to treat various psychological conditions through specially designed soundscapes. These applications have shown remarkable effectiveness in clinical trials, but long-term users report side effects that mirror the experiences of the original Whitaker family: enhanced auditory sensitivity, synesthesia, and the ability to hear sounds that others cannot perceive. Some users develop an addiction to these auditory experiences, spending increasing amounts of time in isolation with headphones, gradually losing their ability to function in normal social situations. The modern incarnations of these 5 families have created a network of interconnected influence that extends far beyond their original Appalachian territories. Their corporations collaborate on projects that combine their respective supernatural advantages, creating technologies and services that are simultaneously beneficial and insidiously corrupting. A data center powered by Thornton Energy, processing information for Carver media content, stored on servers that analyze user health data for Lowel medical platforms, while users consume Whitaker entertainment that primes them for the entire cycle. This network has identified and cultivated new families willing to make similar bargains. Corporate recruitment focuses on individuals facing desperate circumstances, offering them opportunities that seem too good to be true. Young entrepreneurs are invited to exclusive conferences in remote locations. Struggling artists are offered recording contracts with unusual terms, and medical researchers are provided with funding for projects that push ethical boundaries. The contracts these modern initiates sign are masterpieces of legal obfuscation, containing clauses that would make their supernatural obligations clear to anyone familiar with the original mountain folklore, but appearing as standard corporate agreements to conventional lawyers. These documents bind signatories to obligations that extend beyond their professional lives, affecting their families, their health, and their fundamental humanity. The most disturbing development is the family's expansion into genetic research and biotechnology. Using their accumulated wealth and influence, they've established research facilities that study the hereditary aspects of their supernatural abilities. These facilities, disguised as legitimate medical research centers, are attempting to isolate and replicate the genetic changes that occurred in the original bloodlines. Early results suggest they've achieved partial success in transferring some supernatural abilities to non-family members through treatments that combine gene therapy with exposure to materials from the original supernatural sites. Volunteers for these experimental treatments are recruited from among the desperate and dying, people who have exhausted conventional medical options and are willing to accept any alternative. The implications are staggering. If these families succeed in their research, they could create a new class of human beings bound to supernatural entities, spreading their influence far beyond the limited numbers of their original bloodlines. The age of isolated mountain clans making desperate bargains with ancient forces may be ending, replaced by a systematic program of supernatural enhancement that could affect millions of people. The ancient hungers that once demanded monthly blood sacrifices and ritual offerings have evolved to feed on modern forms of human suffering, data privacy violations, social media addiction, financial anxiety, medical desperation, and cultural manipulation. The mountain entities that once required direct physical proximity to their human servants now influence global populations through digital networks, corporate structures, and mass media. These families' success demonstrates that supernatural forces can adapt to technological progress, finding new ways to harvest human suffering and desperation, regardless of how society changes. Their story serves as a warning that some bargains transcend time and technology, and that the price of supernatural power remains constant even as the methods of payment evolve. The mountains still keep their secrets, but those secrets now flow through fiber optic cables, broadcast through cellular towers, and influence decisions made in boardrooms around the world. The isolation that once contained these supernatural influences has been replaced by global connectivity that allows them to reach anyone, anywhere, who becomes desperate enough to make a deal. But the true horror wasn't in what these families had achieved, it was in what they left behind. Because you see, when you make a deal with forces beyond human understanding, the contract doesn't end with death. It evolves. By the 1940s, the surviving members of all 5 families had begun to notice something disturbing. Their children were being born with an innate understanding of the old bargains. They would speak of the mind spirits in their sleep, hum melodies that hadn't been taught to them, and demonstrate healing abilities that required no training. The bloodline remembers what the mind forgets. The Holloway descendants found themselves drawn to industrial accidents, arriving at mining disasters with uncanny timing. They would emerge from collapsed tunnels, carrying survivors, their eyes reflecting lamplight like their ancestors. Mining companies began hiring them as safety consultants, never questioning their supernatural ability to predict cave-ins. The family had learned to monetize their curse. The Carvers transitioned from timber to real estate development, but their projects always required clearing specific parcels of forest. They would acquire land through shell companies, harvest the timber using methods that left no witnesses, and then construct luxury developments on the cleared ground. Residents of these communities reported unusually vivid dreams and an inexplicable compulsion to plant gardens, as though the earth itself was hungry for cultivation. Margaret Lowell's descendants established a network of alternative medicine clinics throughout the Appalachian region. They specialized in treating conditions that traditional medicine couldn't cure, always working in remote locations where medical records were poorly maintained. Patients described miraculous recoveries, but follow-up investigations revealed that many of these individuals had simply vanished from their communities entirely, leaving behind only confused family members who couldn't quite remember why they'd been worried. The Thorntons expanded their energy empire by acquiring mineral rights to properties above underground cave systems. Their geologists possessed an uncanny ability to locate untapped natural gas deposits, particularly in areas where local folklore warned of supernatural activity. Their drilling operations always maintained restricted access zones, and their safety protocols included provisions for incidents that weren't covered in any industry manual. The Whitakers diversified into recording technology, founding a company that specialized in capturing and enhancing audio that other equipment couldn't process. Musicians would travel from across the country to record at their studios, drawn by the promise of achieving sounds that seemed to transcend normal human hearing. Many of these artists reported breakthrough creative experiences, but their subsequent work often contained hidden elements that listeners found deeply unsettling. The most disturbing development came in the 1960s when representatives from all 5 families began meeting annually at a location that no official records acknowledge. These gatherings, held during the winter solstice, brought together the inheritors of 5 different supernatural bargains. They shared techniques, traded resources, and most importantly, began coordinating their activities. What emerged was a network of influence that extended far beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The families had learned to adapt their ancient practices to modern systems. Instead of individual rituals performed in hidden locations, they began incorporating their supernatural elements into legitimate business operations, government contracts, and cultural institutions. The Holloway mining network provided rare earth minerals to technology companies, but their extraction methods involved processes that conventional geology couldn't explain. Their mines produced materials with properties that enhanced electronic devices in ways that engineers found impossible to replicate. Silicon Valley executives learned not to ask questions about the Holloway family's mining techniques as long as their products continued to outperform all competitors. Carver developments became the preferred locations for corporate retreats and executive conferences. Business leaders would arrive for routine meetings and leave with inexplicably altered perspectives on their company's directions. Major policy decisions affecting entire industries were often made at Carver properties, though the executives involved could never fully explain the reasoning behind their choices. The Lowel Medical Network expanded into pharmaceutical research, developing treatments that showed remarkable efficacy in clinical trials but produced unusual side effects that weren't captured in standard medical documentation. Patients reported not just physical healing, but profound psychological changes, as though their very identity had been subtly altered by the treatment process. Thornton Energy became a major supplier to government facilities, providing power to installations that weren't acknowledged in public records. Their energy systems required minimal maintenance and produced efficiency ratings that defied conventional physics. Military contractors learned to accept these anomalies as classified technology, never questioning the source of Thornton's capabilities. The Whitaker recording empire influenced the music industry by providing audio enhancement services to major labels. Songs processed through their technology achieved unprecedented emotional impact on listeners, creating musical experiences that seemed to bypass rational thought and directly affect the subconscious. The most successful pop artists of the past 5 decades had all recorded using Whitaker technology at some point in their careers. By the 1980s, the five families had established what researchers now recognize as a shadow economy built on supernatural foundations. Their businesses operated within legal frameworks, their employees received regular paychecks, and their services were genuinely valued by clients. But the underlying mechanisms that powered their success remained rooted in the same dark bargains their ancestors had made in desperate moments over a century earlier. The families had discovered that supernatural forces adapted to changing times just as readily as human institutions. The entities they had originally encountered in mine shafts and forest clearings had evolved alongside human society, learning to work through corporate structures, government agencies, and digital networks. What had once required blood rituals in hidden caves now operated through quarterly earnings reports and regulatory compliance. Modern descendants of the five families often didn't fully understand their inherited abilities. They simply knew they possessed unusual talents for their respective industries, talents that had been passed down through generations of successful family businesses. Many genuinely believed their prosperity came from superior business acumen rather than supernatural influence. But the old hungers remained, and they had grown more sophisticated in their feeding methods. Instead of claiming individual victims in isolated mountain communities, the evolved entities now harvested energy from much larger populations through subtler means. The desperation that had originally drawn the families to make their bargains had become a renewable resource, continuously generated by modern society's anxieties and unfulfilled desires. The true genius of the family's evolution lay in their recognition that supernatural influence worked best when it remained invisible. Their most successful operations appeared completely mundane to outside observers, distinguished only by their unusual effectiveness and the subtle psychological changes they produced in those who interacted with them. As we moved into the digital age, all five families invested heavily in information technology, recognizing that data networks provided unprecedented opportunities for expanding their influence. The same forces that had once been confined to specific geographical locations could now operate globally through internet connections, reaching into homes and businesses across the world. The children of these families, now adults running multinational corporations, had learned to think in terms of market penetration and user engagement rather than blood sacrifice and ritual communion. But the underlying transaction remained the same: human desperation exchanged for supernatural assistance, with the true cost always hidden until long after the bargain had been struck. And in the deepest, most protected archives of each family's corporate headquarters, the original artifacts remain: the coal that glows with its own light, the timber that whispers when no wind blows, the herbs that heal impossible wounds, the oil that flows upward against gravity, and the instruments that play melodies no human composed. These objects serve as anchors, connecting the modern business empires to the ancient powers that still fuel their success. The mountains remember, the mist preserves, and in boardrooms, and server farms around the world, the descendants of 5 desperate families continue to honor bargains that were never meant to end. The legacy of these cursed bloodlines extends far beyond their original mountain territories. By the late 1800s, as America underwent rapid industrialization and westward expansion, these families found new ways to spread their influence through the very infrastructure of a modernizing nation. The Holloways, enriched by their supernatural coal operations, began investing in railroad companies that would carry their cursed fuel across the continent. Workers on these railways reported strange phenomena. Locomotives burning Holloway coal would sometimes continue running for hours after their fires should have died, their whistles echoing through mountain passes with sounds that resembled human screams. Train crews developed superstitions about certain shipments, leaving small offerings of tobacco and whiskey in the coal cars to appease whatever dwelt within the black stones. More disturbing were the accidents. Railway disasters involving Holloway coal followed predictable patterns. Exactly one crew member would perish in each incident, always in ways that defied explanation. Bodies would be found positioned as though they had been carefully arranged, their faces bearing expressions of profound terror mixed with strange acceptance. Railroad companies learned to rotate crews frequently on routes carrying Holloway shipments, though they never officially acknowledged why. The Carver timber empire adapted to changing times by diversifying into paper production and eventually into publishing. By the 1890s, Carver paper mills were producing materials for newspapers, books, and government documents across the eastern United States. Employees at these facilities reported that the paper possessed unusual qualities. Ink seemed to flow more smoothly, creating text that appeared unusually sharp and compelling. Readers often found themselves unable to stop reading documents printed on Carver paper, describing an almost hypnotic quality to the words. Writers and journalists who used Carver paper exclusively began producing work of exceptional quality, their articles and stories capturing public attention with unprecedented intensity. However, these same writers often complained of vivid nightmares featuring endless forests and the sound of children laughing just beyond the tree line. Several prominent authors who achieved fame using Carver paper died under mysterious circumstances, always found in wooded areas despite living in urban environments. The Lowel healing tradition evolved with the times, adapting to an era of emerging medical science. Hannah Lowell, the last known practitioner of the old ways, had supposedly vanished into the mountains in 1972, but reports began surfacing of a new phenomenon. Doctors and nurses across Appalachia started experiencing unusual diagnostic abilities, particularly those who had grown up in the region. They could sense illness before symptoms appeared, predict recovery times with uncanny accuracy, and seemed to instinctively know which treatments would prove most effective. These medical professionals shared certain characteristics. They aged prematurely. Their hands bore unusual scars that appeared without explanation, and they suffered from chronic insomnia, accompanied by nightmares so intense they often required sedation. Most disturbing, they reported feeling compelled to visit specific locations in the mountains during their time off, returning with no memory of what they had done there, but bearing new knowledge of rare diseases and innovative treatments. Medical journals began documenting cases of inexplicable recoveries in rural hospitals throughout the region. Patients with terminal diagnoses would experience complete remissions after brief interactions with certain staff members. When investigators attempted to study these phenomena, they found that the medical personnel involved would suddenly transfer to different facilities or simply disappear from employment records altogether. The Thornton energy empire embraced the Industrial Revolution with supernatural efficiency. Their coal operations expanded rapidly, supplying fuel for the steel mills and factories that powered America's growth. But workers in facilities burning Thornton coal reported strange side effects. Productivity increased dramatically, with laborers able to work longer hours without fatigue. However, these same workers developed an unsettling dependency on their workplace environments. Factory workers who had been exposed to Thornton coal smoke for extended periods found themselves unable to sleep properly when away from industrial settings. They would wander the streets at night, drawn to areas where coal smoke hung in the air. Many relocated their families to live as close as possible to their factories, claiming they felt physically ill when separated from the industrial atmosphere for more than a few hours. The coal itself seemed to burn with unusual properties. Furnaces fed with Thornton coal produced flames that burned in unnatural colors, shifting from deep red to blue to colors that witnesses struggled to describe. The heat generated was more intense than standard coal should produce, yet the fires never seemed to consume the fuel completely. Workers reported finding the same chunks of coal burning day after day, as though they were somehow regenerating. The Whitaker musical legacy transformed as America's entertainment industry emerged. Family members began appearing in traveling shows and eventually in the early recording industry, though their music could never be properly captured on wax cylinders or phonograph records. Live performances, however, became legendary. Audiences would travel hundreds of miles to hear a Whitaker perform, often describing the experience as life-changing. The family's influence spread through the entertainment networks of the growing nation. Musicians who learned songs from Whitaker family members found their own careers flourishing, though they paid a price. These secondary performers developed the same physical abnormalities as the original family, their fingers elongating and their hearing becoming painfully acute. They also reported being visited by the same mysterious composer in their dreams, receiving new arrangements that seemed to bypass their conscious minds entirely. Music halls and theaters that regularly featured Whitaker-influenced performances became known for their unusual atmosphere. Patrons would often experience shared hallucinations during shows, seeing the same visions of ancient forests and shadowy figures moving just beyond perception. Some venues reported that their acoustics seemed to improve after hosting these performances, as though the buildings themselves had been somehow enhanced by the music. By the turn of the century, these 5 families had woven themselves into the fabric of American industry and culture. Their supernatural bargains, struck in remote mountain hollows, now influenced the coal that powered factories, the timber that built cities, the healing that took place in hospitals, the energy that lit homes, and the music that entertained millions. Yet the costs of their ancient pacts continued to manifest in new and troubling ways. Industrial accidents in facilities using their products followed the same patterns as the original mountain tragedies. Newspapers printed on Carver paper seemed to influence public opinion with unusual effectiveness, shaping political movements and social changes in ways that historians would later struggle to explain. Medical breakthroughs attributed to Appalachian trained doctors came at the cost of practitioners who aged rapidly and died young, their knowledge seemingly extracted at the expense of their life force. The families themselves had become something beyond human, their bloodlines carrying forward the consequences of bargains made in desperation generations earlier. They had traded their humanity for power, wealth, and influence, and as America entered the 20th century, their supernatural legacy continued to spread through the very infrastructure of the modern world, ensuring that the ancient hungers dwelling in the Appalachian Mountains would never want for sustenance. These families discovered that some bargains can never be broken, and some hungers can never be satisfied. The shadows in these ancient hollows still move when no wind blows, and locals whisper that the mountains remember everything. If you've ever felt watched while walking alone in the deep woods, now you know why. What chills you most about these cursed bloodlines? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more dark tales from America's forgotten corners.